the state,
from state,
the state, United States,
the state,
the state,
to the nation,
our nation,
to the nation,
this nation, our nation,
one nation.
What's going on? Mr. Lee here, and welcome to the first part of the political unit. And we've all heard these terms being thrown around by politicians and presidents, but we might not have been able to truly distinguish the words, especially in reference to human geography. So today we will go over basic political terms and go over boundary disputes around the world. So starting with the idea of a state technically will have the following three characteristics: permanent population, defined territory, and a government of some sort. And I like to refer to these as what we label as countries in our everyday use. They have defined boundaries and people who reside within these boundaries, which brings us to the concept of nations. In human geography, a nation is a group of people with common descent, culture, and history, and basically you want to associate a nation with people who reside in the country. Essentially, it's citizens. Now, I implore you to focus on these two terms because if you understand these two right here, the next few terms will make a lot more sense. First, we have the idea of a nation state, which is often associated with a homogeneous state, where one ethnic group makes up a big chunk of the population. Some examples of this concept would be Egypt and Korea. In both these countries, they have more than 90% of one ethnic group. Then we have the idea of a multinational state, and take a second to try and figure out what this might mean. As mind-blowing as this might be, this is a state, aka a country, with multiple nations, so multiple ethnic groups. Two really good examples of these would be former Yugoslavia, which used to have multiple ethnic groups like the Croatians, Romanians, and the United Kingdom, which is home to multiple ethnic groups like the English, Scottish, and the Irish. There's also the multi-state nation, which is when an ethnic group stretches across multiple borders of a country. If you look at Koreans, they're a really good example of this. As Koreans, the ethnic group stretch across two countries, Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea. The Kurdish nation is also a really good example of this, as the ethnic group stretches across multiple states such as Armenia, Turkey, and Iraq. Speaking of the Kurds, they transition us perfectly to our next term, which would be stateless nations. Stateless nations represent ethnic groups that have no country to call their own. The Kurds have been asking for their own country for decades but have seen no success. And another example of a stateless nation would be Palestine. As of right now, only some countries recognize them as a state. However, many do not, and we are seeing the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the news over this idea of sovereignty. Other than states and nations, there's also autonomous regions, which are regions that are within another state and somewhat self-ruled, with a little bit of oversight from the surrounding government. These areas are often a byproduct of colonialism, and we can see some examples in China, one in particular being Macau, which is sort of like the Vegas of China, and they abide by a different set of rules because of their political influence from the Portuguese. Then there's semi-autonomous regions, which are given much less political freedom than the autonomous regions, but they still experience a sense of self-government compared to the rest of the country. In the United States, some really good examples of these would be the Native American reservations. That's why you see so many casinos in these regions, as they do not have to abide by the gambling laws in their states. You'll notice that many of these terms have the underlying principle of sovereignty and self-determination. Sovereignty is the idea of freedom within their borders, and self-determination is the process of achieving said freedom.
That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
We saw this with the 13 colonies and how they wanted to gain sovereignty after years of taxation without representation. Thus, they sought out self-determination through the Revolutionary War. Ultimately, the conflict between Israel and Palestine in the Middle East comes down to these two terms. Both sides want to establish sovereignty within their borders and want self-determination in respect to certain regions in the highly disputed area, obviously with religious undertones as well. Also, a very important term for this unit is the Berlin Conference, which was a meeting among major European powers in the 19th century where they met to discuss the carving of Africa. And through this conference, they created political borders without any input from African ethnic groups. This demonstrates the effects of colonialism on borders and ethnic disputes, as they did not take into consideration the major ethno-linguistic differences between the tribes, and this led to years of civil war and disputes. For example, the Dinkas and the Nueras were put into Sudan, and this led to years of conflict and ethnic cleansing. Eventually, this devolutionary movement eventually led to the secession of South Sudan, and it became its own country. Then there's the idea of Balkanization, which is when a state fragments into multiple regional sectors. The best example of this process occurring in history was with Yugoslavia in the 90s. As communism in the Eastern Bloc was losing influence, many of the smaller nations decided that they wanted independence, like Croatia, Albania, Serbia, and this led to the Balkanization of the region. Now, political power is often represented by means of gaining control over three things: control over land, resources, and the people. And it doesn't always mean that countries must completely dominate smaller countries, especially with the concept of neocolonialism, where countries now dominate the economies of foreign states instead of colonizing them like the good old days. An example of neocolonialism was the US involvement in Iraq, as we went to war on the premise that they had weapons of mass destruction, but in reality, it was to gain economic control over the Middle East and to instill ideas of democracy and to remove Saddam Hussein from a position of power. Some other examples can be seen with China's economic influence over African countries, as they provided gigantic loans to African states and invested heavily in African infrastructure to gain influence in the future. This is because China wants influence over the developing countries, and if the African countries default on their loan, it would give China much more economic influence. Control can also come in the form of choke points, as countries will often fight over regions where trade routes are concentrated, like the Suez Canal. And just to show you how much money goes through these choke points, when the Ever Given was blocking the Suez Canal, they estimated about $9.6 billion being lost every day globally. There's also the Strait of Hormuz, which they call the jugular of the world because of the sheer amount of petroleum that passes through this area, and it's no wonder that Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the surrounding countries fight for control over this strait all the time. Shatterbelts are created when two opposing stronger powers are fighting over a resource or a piece of land, and the Eastern Bloc and Korea are really good examples. The Korean War became a matter of territoriality, as groups are fighting to gain control and influence over a piece of land, in this case the Korean Peninsula. You have North Korea and South Korea, and behind these two regions you have the Chinese supporting the North and the US supporting the South. When the Armistice Agreement was established in the 1950s to end the war in Korea, they delimited a border on the 38th parallel, which means to draw out borders on a map. Then the process of demarcating occurred, which means the borders are actually drawn out in the real world with fences and walls. Thus, this created the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. A demilitarized zone is an area where the military is not allowed and essentially acts as a buffer zone. Now let's dive into the various types of borders that exist around the world, starting with a relic boundary, which is a boundary that no longer exists. Think of what a relic is. It is usually ancient and old, and an example of a relic boundary would be the border between East and West Germany, which no longer exists. Then we have superimposed boundaries, and these are boundaries that have been imposed onto ethnic groups from outside powers. So basically all of Africa would be a good example of superimposed boundaries, as the Berlin Conference established these borders without the consent of African tribes. There's also antecedent boundary, and this word sounds a lot like ancestor. So it is a boundary that was created long before the borders were delimited. Mountain ranges and rivers usually create the antecedent boundaries, and the border between Chile and Argentina, which is essentially split by the Andes Mountain, is an antecedent boundary. Geometric boundaries go along longitudes and latitudes and are generally straight lines, and the best example of this is the border between our friendly neighbors up north and the United States. Lastly, there are consequent boundaries, and these boundaries are the consequence of ethnic or cultural differences. Because two sides cannot agree on policies and forms of government, they will split into two countries and create borders. And the best example of this is with Pakistan and India, where the two sides split because of religious differences, Pakistan being Muslim and India being Hindu. And finally, we need to talk about UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. And I know that was a mouthful, but basically this is just broken down into four major parts. You have the territorial sea, which is basically just an extension of the mainland, so all the laws apply here as it does on land. Essentially in this region, you have both economic and political control, as you can control immigration and even extend all of your laws. Then as you go further out, countries will have less and less control, which brings us to the exclusive economic zone. In this region, which is 200 nautical miles off the coast, countries can only control the resources and how it is extracted. For example, fish, oil, and other resources. After the EEZ, you have the high seas, which is international waters, and people must abide by international laws in the high seas. The EEZ has led to quite a bit of conflict, as you can only imagine the disputes that surface as a byproduct of EEZs being close to one another. And the most prominent one is in the South China Sea. As you can see with the blue lines, this region was already highly disputed with the Southeast Asian countries. However, China claims that they have historical claims over this region, called the 9-dash line. In order to extend their sphere of influence and their EEZ, China has been creating these military islands in order to gain territoriality over the region, creating a lot of international turmoil. All right, that does it for the first part of the political unit. Don't forget to go to the Quizlet in order to brush up on the vocabulary terms linked in the description down below. Have a fantastic day.